What if you could launch a newsletter like Morning Brew or The Hustle, but with zero writers? In this video, we're gonna show you exactly how we built the Recap AI, a fully automated AI newsletter that's already being read by tens of thousands of people, and it runs itself. You'll get the full behind the scenes on how we built it using AI, from sourcing stories to writing content to growing the audience. The best part, this same system can be applied to any niche, and it has the potential to generate hundreds of thousands to millions in ad and sponsorship revenue. If you've ever wanted to run a media business without a content team, this is your blueprint. So let's jump in. All right, so jumping in here, we are in the newsletter agent workflow. I'm going to be doing a demo on start to finish how we go from this workflow to a completely finished daily newsletter. You can see here, quantum computing unlocks better AI fine tuning and a whole bunch of featured stories. And so this is the Recaps newsletter. You can drop your email so that you receive this every day. Tens of thousands of people read this newsletter today, this daily newsletter. So make sure you subscribe, and we're going to jump in and show exactly how we generate this with AI. Okay, so this system is split into really two different work streams, which are designed to mimic a human, writer of a newsletter. And so it's designed to mimic that process. So the first process is what we'd call our AI data ingestion, where we're going out and pulling content from all across the internet. So this includes, as you can see here, content from popular AI companies' blogs, the Google News API, various subreddits that are relevant to this niche. Again, Hacker News, the Google News API, various other news sources that cover the AI space. And we're pulling all of that in addition to, we have a separate one for scraping Twitter, but relevant Twitter content, again, pertaining to the AI space. And all of that, essentially text content, gets cleaned up. There's a process here that validates that it is about AI before it gets saved into our data lake in Cloudflare. And so that is the first process. Again, we're going to be diving into the guts and the details of all of this in the next section of this video, but this is more of a high-level demo. I just want to show the whole thing working end to end. So every day, that system is pulling in text content and saving it to a specific date within our AI data lake, as we call it. And then this agent is able to call out to that data lake and say, hey, I want to see all of the text content for yesterday, June 6th, 2025. And based on all that text data, I am going to write stinking good newsletter right on all of what happened in AI for that date. So just like a human would do, we're trying to research what happened on XYZ date, and we need to write a newsletter about it. So let's go ahead and kick off this workflow, and I'll walk through it as we go. So the first step is we need to decide the date that we want this newsletter written for, and that determines, again, what data gets pulled from Cloudflare. The next thing is we need to actually copy paste the prior version of the newsletter. I already have that in my clipboard here to make sure that we don't duplicate any stories. So those are the only two triggers. And then we'll jump in and we can see it's churning through. And the first task is it's retrieving all of that markdown content from our Cloudflare data lake. It's then also retrieving all of the Twitter content, which is just stored slightly differently. Okay, so now it has all of that context and data pertaining to yesterday's or today's or whatever day you select, what happened in AI, the industry, for that particular day. And now it'll start to loop through and decide, okay, what out of all this data, what is the most important stories that my audience is going to care about? And it's going to select, 3, 4, or 5 of the most important stories. All of the prompts that power these calls will be available for free in our school community. The link's in the video description. So if you want to dive into these, and we'll dive much deeper, as I already mentioned, in the next portion of this video. All right, real quick, if you want the exact prompts and the exact template for this n8n automation that you can download and pull into your own business. You can get it completely for free by joining our school community AI automation mastery. Completely for free. Just click on the video that you want the automation template for. This includes all of the prompting and everything you need to recreate this for your business. And you can just download it here in the school community. So join, we'll see you there. And let's get back to the video. So I'm going to pause as this takes a little bit of time, and we'll jump back in when it's complete. All right, and we're back. And so it is finished picking the top stories. And now it shares them in a Slack channel. So we still have human in the loop for a lot of this because we want to make sure, essentially provide an editor's touch on the newsletter still. So here we can see in our newsletter channel, these are the selected top stories that it picked for the day we selected. So AI's billion-dollar heist, a new British firm, yada, yada. China's AI blackout in an unprecedented move to ensure fairness. Major Chinese tech giants like Alibaba temporarily disabled key functions of their AI chatbots to prevent students from cheating. So that's pretty interesting. The AI waste sorter, Australian researchers. So those are the stories that it selected. And so as the human in the loop, I can either approve now or provide feedback here. This is going to trigger a prompt for it to maybe, if we say, hey, this story I didn't like, pick a different one, it will loop back through and grab a different one. But for time purposes, let's add approved. And it will kick back off and see that. Boom. And so now we're into the next section. So we approved the stories that it selected from the data lake. And now it is tasked with writing the subject line and the pre-header for the email based on all of those stories, as that subject line will be used downstream when it's actually writing all of the content based on the selected stories. So this also takes a little bit of time, so I'll come back when it's complete. All right, and we're back, and we can see it is finished writing the subject line. And again, we have a human in the loop step here, and it shares it in our newsletter Slack channel. And here you can see the subject line it is done or selected is AI trained on 130,000 stolen scripts, plus China's AI exam blackout, escaping AI pilot hell, and an AI that sorts waste. We also ask it to come up with a number of alternatives. AI secret training data, 130,000 scripts. So let's say I actually like this one better, and this is where the human in the loop can be very helpful. I'm going to add feedback and say, let's use this one. And we will submit that to, and it'll pull it into a new prompt that incorporates that feedback. And we could tell it anything, right? This is just human language prompting, and it will incorporate the feedback into this section of the workflow. And so that's what it's doing now, and we'll let it run. Okay, we can see here, because I told it to edit the subject line, it loops back into this edit subject line node. It is doing that, and then it will go back through and finish out. And there we go. Now we can see this whole section is complete, which means it's going to jump forward into the final section, which is actually writing all of the content for the newsletter. Okay, and here we can see it is churning through. So what this section is tasked with now is it receives all of the selected stories that were chosen earlier, as well as the subject line and pre-header. And now it starts to iterate over each section and actually write the contents of that section. And so there's been a whole bunch of prompting, and there's some data cleanup in here as well to allow that to happen. So now it is going to loop through every single section, write it based on the prompting, and then move forward from there. Okay, and here we go. It has completely finished looping over each selected story and written the actual breakdown for the story that gets included, in a daily newsletter, such as this portion. Now, the final step is to loop through and write the introduction for that day's newsletter, the shortlist section, and it will also format the full newsletter in Markdown so that it's super easy just to copy paste into, we use Beehive. And so as you can see here is the shortlist section. So this is just going to pull any other relevant, great stories that didn't get featured in a full section. And it's also going to write this intro, which is kind of a highlight on the top story, as well as an overview of what is going to be included. And so once this is complete, it posts the full newsletter with all of the formatting in Slack, as you can see here. And we can open that up, and here it is. And this is in Markdown format, the full newsletter for that day. We would copy paste this over into Beehive, and we can send it out to tens of thousands of people, completely automated. All right, so real quick, before we jump into the deeper demo, I want to let you guys know that you can get this full n8n template breaking down all of this section, including the prompts and everything, completely for free by going to our AI Automation Mastery School community. The link is in the description. You can join and you can get the whole template, the JSON for this automation free within the community just by downloading it, clicking on the video and downloading it from there. Then you can tune this to your workflows and play with it. And that's it. So make sure to join our school community completely for free. The link is in the description. And also make sure to like and subscribe this video. We're going to be doing a ton more AI automation breakdowns, how we're doing things here at the Recap and the other businesses that we run. So you're not going to want to miss all of the new content that we're planning. All right, with that, I'm going to pass it off to Lucas to dive into the guts of all of this workflow, including the prompting, every single node. So let's jump over there.
So next up, I want to take you guys through a deep walkthrough of this entire automation that will go section by section, node by node, through everything that you see here so that you can gain a complete understanding of how everything is working together to build out our newsletter. By the very end of this, you're going to have a solid grasp on how to take this n8n template, how to modify its key components so you can generate a newsletter on your own that covers any topic that you'd like. So before we dive into everything that you see here on our AI newsletter agent, we do need to switch gears a bit and talk about how we can gather the relevant AI news stories that we're going to be writing about each and every day. If we look here at the top of our AI newsletter agent, we're going to see that after the trigger is fired, we have these two steps called retrieve markdown content and retrieve Twitter content that are going to be responsible for reaching out to our data lake, pulling in all of the AI news stories that have been scraped for the day, converting that into a good format for LLMs to understand, and then passing all of that context through the rest of the prompts that we're going to use to pick out the top stories and actually write the newsletter content. So let's switch gears here and go over to this second automation that we've built out that is going to set up the scraping pipeline. Looking here, we have a couple of different sections built out for all of the different content that is going to be scraped. Up at the top here, we have a flow here that is going through the full process of scraping relevant AI news off Twitter. And as we go into this green section here, labeled web content, we have a bunch of triggers set up that are all going to be responsible for scraping AI news stories from a bunch of different feeds. So we can see here at the top, we have all of our blog related news that we're going to be scraping from OpenAI, from Google AI, from Anthropic. As we go down, we have another section here that has scheduled triggers set up to scrape all of the AI news we want to from Reddit. And finally, at the bottom here, we have a couple of miscellaneous feeds set up to scrape AI news off of Hacker News and off a Google News feed that we've configured. And finally, at the bottom, we have newsletters that we're scraping from ourselves just to make sure that we have our bases completely covered in any given day to make sure that we have really gone out and captured every single bit of AI news. After this all runs, what we're going to do is let that information get scraped and pushed downstream into our choice of persistence, which is going to be an S3 bucket we have set up in Cloudflare. So if I tab over to Cloudflare and start searching for the day we need to retrieve news from, you guys can see what it looks like inside our data lake. And so we have this folder set up for every piece of AI news that's going to get scraped for a day. And then when I open this up, we have this long list of AI news stories that have been captured from the internet, pulled in, and stored in a markdown file that's going to be clean and easy for us to read and do later downstream processing on. So this is really the hub where everything we scrape off the internet is going to go off and get saved into. The point I want to mention here when coming back to the workflow is this is actually just a design choice that we made when building this automation. You can use whatever persistence, storage layer, storage system you want for this data you're scraping. Just for our use case, S3 and Cloudflare made the most sense. Other options could be saving to a Dropbox folder, could be saving to Google Drive, or even inserting the documents in raw markdown you've scraped off the internet into your own database like Supabase. Really, in terms of storage, you have a lot of flexibility here, and just choose the right tool for the job when you're going forward and building this on your own. So that covers a little bit about what we're doing at a high level. Let's actually walk through an example here so you can see what is happening node by node and how you can actually set up a data feed like this for any sort of topic you're trying to scrape off the internet. So I have this Reddit trigger set up here. If I blow this up, we're going to be looking every 3 hours at a specific RSS.app feed we've configured to pull all Reddit posts off from a specific subreddit. And so RSS.app is great for this. It really makes it easy to automate some of the data gathering process for this scraping operation. Here's our account that we've set up and all of the different feeds we have configured. And so if we want to make a new one, we can actually just click new feed, load up a subreddit. Let's just do AI. You can click generate. And then after that process is finished, you're going to be able to actually see a full feed of every Reddit post that is coming through. Super useful and does a lot of the heavy lifting when it comes to sourcing stories that you don't have to build on your own. Let's go ahead and copy one of the feed URLs that's generated here after we have it created so you guys can see what that looks like. So I'll load this in Chrome, click on Pretty Print, and under this items array that appears here, we can see a nicely formatted list of all of the posts that are on the subreddit. Perfect for our use case, and is going to allow us to go forward with further scraping. Let me jump back. So once that's done, we're going to grab that exact same JSON response so we can see that items array is still appearing here and get every Reddit post from the subreddit every 3 hours. After that's done, we're going to split that data out so we go from our single list to 50 individual items that were scraped off the feed and actually call into this Reddit node that's going to use the post resource, get the post itself from the subreddit we've configured so we can see the full text content and all of the other metadata associated with that individual Reddit post. If we're just going off the RSS.app data, we're only going to get the text content that's included in the post. And so for our use case, it was important to get additional metadata. We're going to then use a filter node here to actually filter out any of the Reddit posts that aren't interesting to what we're trying to scrape. So in our instance, we are really just looking for links on Reddit that are going to outside sources. So this could be a new model getting released from Anthropic. This could be some kind of AI breakthrough or development that's on a different news site or a company's page. Those are the kind of articles, links, and stories we are trying to go in our scraping operation so we can capture it and later write about it in our newsletter. And so when I blow up this filter, we're going to see that we're filtering out anything that is, a text post hosted on Reddit, anything that's going out to a Twitter, YouTube link, anything that's on GitHub, or any link that is actually going out to one of Reddit's image services or video services. What we're interested right now for our use case is actually capturing those external links to other stories. Clicking ahead here on our same Reddit example, we have this code block that is going to be responsible for doing a little bit of data cleanup and data formatting, just how we would like to go forward. This isn't necessarily important for your own scraping operation or your own data pipeline, but we felt it was important for us to be able to attach some metadata along to the story that we're going out and capturing. So this will include things like what source is it coming from, what type of feed did we set up here, what is the publication date of the story. That is important for us so we can group stories date by date. Things of that nature that is just good to have metadata that we can pass along through this entire workflow. And so you can see here that pretty much every single feed we've set up follows this exact same pattern of going from a scheduled trigger to fetching data from an RSS.app feed, splitting that out, and then doing some normalization in a code block that gets all of that metadata all together in a single format that's going to be easy for us to use later. Similar to that, every single feed that we set up here is then going to get wired up and hooked into this set field node, which we call get identity. This is taking all of that normalized data, organizing it nicely, and so we have the same variable name we're able to later use in expressions and later on in our workflow. So the reason we approached it this way is essentially so we can avoid a bunch of copy pasting and edits necessary when we want to make changes to the pipeline. For however many feeds we have set up here, a dozen or so, if we need to update how we are going to scrape, we don't have to go through a dozen different nodes to actually update how we scrape each one. We have this singular pipeline that every source we're working with is just going to hook into. Going ahead to the next step, we are actually going to be calling into our S3 bucket, which is our data lake that we're saving everything into, to go ahead and search if a resource already exists. This is important for us to avoid wasting a lot of scraping credits by actually going out and checking if the article that we just sourced from our trigger and earlier in the pipeline already exists in our system so we can skip it over. So we're going to use the bucket resource, the search operation, and plug in the name of our bucket to go ahead and search for the article that we just fetched. And so this is the unique name of the web article that we scraped online. We have the date attached to it from that metadata we grabbed earlier. And then we're just doing a little bit of string operations on top of this to get this into an easy to read format. So if we see this exact same article from the exact same website, The Guardian, pop up again, we're not going to waste a bunch of scraping credits as we go through this automation in order to keep this as efficient as possible, as fast as possible, and cost effective as possible while the full automation runs. So after we finish searching for those existing resources, we have a filter node here, which is simply going to exclude any resource that already exists. So again, really trying to keep this as efficient and cost effective as possible. Moving on, we have a brief delay set up here to avoid any sort of race condition going on between the filtering and a previous run already saving that article. And once that completes, we're actually going to call into the sub workflow we've built out that is going to scrape the provided URL that has been passed into it from this get identity node. So we're setting our URL here. Any duplicates get filtered out. And once we've passed that check, we're going to go ahead and call into our scrape URL workflow. So let's open this up and see how it works. Very simple, only 2 steps here. We have our workflow trigger. That's going to take the URL that we want to scrape from as input. And we are going to then make an HTTP request, a post request, out to the Firecrawl API, which is a service that we use to power all of our scraping. I won't do a deep dive onto the API quite yet. Be sure to check out some of the other videos around Firecrawl we've created to see what you can do. But for this use case, we're making a simple request to this scrape endpoint. So we are able to get out Markdown after the scrape operation finishes, which is going to be in a clean format that we can later prompt against, which is exactly what we're trying to do for writing this newsletter. So just going through here and looking through all of our options, we want to send headers to get this response back in JSON format. And in order to scrape the page we want to, we have to provide a couple of different options here in the body of this request. So make sure you have the body content type set to JSON. You're going to use JSON to build this out, and you have an expression built out here. The most important thing to call out on this request we're building, I know there's a lot here, and most of this you'll just be able to download the workflow and copy in, but just so you can understand this better, the URL is going to be the URL that we're trying to scrape. This will get dynamically filled out with whatever we pass in for the sub workflow, so we're set up there to scrape each and every page that we want. Under formats, the main thing we need to call out here is including this JSON option. Because of the scraping that we're doing, We really want to have control over the prompt that is running to extract the content we need from every news story off the internet. By specifying JSON here, we can actually add JSON options and a prompt underneath that is going to tell Firecrawl what prompt we want to get actually ran against the web page that we're scraping. So for our use case, when we're scraping a large number of articles every single day, we only want the core content that's included on the article itself. And so if I pull up this TechCrunch article here, let's look at this. There's a bunch of other text like the header, the authors, all of these side call to actions included on the webpage that we don't care about. We just really want the main content of the story that is going to get passed through into our LLM when we're writing about it. And so in order to get that main content, we provide underneath JSON options prompt, we give this prompt that is going to tell Firecrawl that we want them to identify the main content of the text and extract that for us. Underneath here is some schema that we provide, just telling Firecrawl the expected data format we're going to get back from them. And that is going to allow us just to get this main text content of whatever page on the internet we're trying to scrape. So that covers it for the actual scraping process itself. Again, I'll be sure to include a download to this scraping sub workflow so you can implement this in your own newsletter agent. Let's jump back. After the scrape operation finishes, we have another filter set up that is going to filter out any errors that came up during the scrape process. This is in place just to make the system more reliable. If we're scraping hundreds, if not thousands of articles off the web every single day, there's inevitably going to be issues that come up either with, Firecrawl timing out or some of these websites having more advanced scrape protection in place. And we want to avoid that. And so the way to get around that, if you go to your settings underneath the scrape URL, we do have a retry here. And we actually want to make sure that on air does use this continue option, which will pass error messages as an item in the regular output. That is going to allow this node to not actually fail when we get a result back and still pass through data with an error note if there is an error. So we then look if there is an error, we see if that does not exist, which means we're only going to continue forward with the items that were able to be successfully scraped, which is just what we want. Moving on, we then have this middle section with two different LLM prompts we're going to run against the scraped data we've extracted. First one is this LLM call we're calling evaluate content. This is very specific for our use case, but I would suggest that you implement something similar in any sort of data pipeline that you're trying to build for your own newsletter. What we're going to do is pass in the content of a web page that was scraped, analyze it to determine if it is actually a full piece of content that would be relevant to our AI newsletter that features stories, advancements, and other interesting happenings in the tech and AI space. So in short, what this prompt is going to do is it's going to filter out the noisy articles that somehow made it through the rest of the feed. And so if there's like some overly political story getting included in the Reddit post, or there's some other kind of, AI adjacent, but not actually relevant to the tech audience story that gets included and scraped, we're doing a quick check here to see if we should actually be including this content in our data lake to later prompt against. We like to do this just to keep the size of the data lake down for whatever day we're trying to write the newsletter for. Ultimately, even though context windows have gotten bigger for what we can prompt against, we still have found that it's been more effective to keep those stories focused to real story candidates when we're going through the process of picking out what's the best story of the day to actually write about. So highly recommend you implement something similar. And if you have issues with noise getting filtered in, I would suggest extending this prompt to include examples of good story examples, bad story examples, things like that. Moving on to the next step is going to be this node where we call try extract external sources. This is another very relevant item to our newsletter, as what it's going to do is it's going to scan the markdown content we recently scraped from a given URL and scan the entire page for any sort of news stories that are still getting linked out to from the page we just scraped. So to break this down in an example, say there's a new Bloomberg article that goes out talking about NVIDIA's latest earnings call. On that article, what Bloomberg is going to be doing is they're going to be writing about the story and likely summarizing a lot of the key details down into a more shorter format. It's good that we're scraping that, but when we're writing our newsletter, we want to dig down and get to the source of the truth or the primary sources on the subject matter that we're covering. And so what we're going to do is we're going to scan that Bloomberg News article, look for any links linking out to primary sources, like say a PDF uploaded to the NVIDIA blog or some other news actually on the NVIDIA website itself that covers that same story, but in more detail. That's going to be something we care about and are going to try and extract here for later scraping and processing. And so that's the gist of it. And we have this big prompt built out here that details what task the AI needs to go out and do, what's the format we're expecting, and giving some good examples on how the AI needs to actually give us a good list of those URLs. So again, depending on the depth that you're covering on your newsletter, this may or may not be needed, but for us, we found this as a critical element to actually extract in our scraping operation. Once this finishes running, it's going to output just a simple list of URLs that were actually extracted that we can see here. And so it does look like there is something uploaded to OpenAI's CDN that goes into more detail about this story, which is perfect. Exactly what we're trying to extract from that blog content on the internet. So going forward here into this last block, this is pretty customized again for our persistence layer, which is this data lake inside of Cloudflare. And so this is probably going to differ depending how you are going to construct your AI data scraping pipeline. If you're wanting to use Google Drive, you could probably replace this with something as simple as a create a file operation or upload file operation and then be done with it. But since we're using an S3 bucket in Cloudflare, there is a little bit more customization we have to do to actually set the metadata on the file, get it uploaded, and then removing a temp file we're using to stage that and get that into a final state. And so if you're building this on your own, I would recommend simplifying this however you can. And so that about covers it here for the AI scraping pipeline. If I come up here to the top, Twitter is structured extremely similarly, with the one exception of how we actually source tweets from the Twitter timeline. We've configured and tuned the For You page of our own Twitter account to actually surface the best AI news stories. And so we've had to build out a little bit of custom logic here to load those For You page tweets and get that into our system. But the core concepts of this workflow are very similar to what we covered here underneath web content. I would suggest if you're trying to do something similar on Twitter, look at the Twitter or x.com API or look for some of the external services and APIs that are able to help you with that scraping and loading up those tweets. Our approach here does involve some extra steps, and that may not be necessary for every single use case. So now that we've set up our data scraping pipeline that is going to fetch and source AI news stories off the internet each day, we can switch gears and come back into our newsletter agent and we'll go through step by step how we're going to take those stories and build a newsletter. If you haven't seen the Recaps newsletter, here's a quick overview of the format that we follow for every single edition. We start with an introduction. We then drill into 3 to 4 key newsletter segments that were sourced from the stories that we scraped off the internet. And so for here, one section is Google supercharges Gemini with our content that we wrote. ChatGPT, your new super assistant, with our content we wrote. And then we have some templated out sections that are not getting written each time by AI, but just exist inside of Beehive. Scrolling forward to the end, we then have what we call the shortlist, which is going to be any news stories that were scraped off the internet, didn't have enough context for us to really expand around, but the AI still thought it was interesting to share in the day's edition of the newsletter. And so that's a quick overview of what we're going to be creating here. Let's jump back in and go section by section so you can see how to build this on your own and how to tune it for your own topic that you're writing about. Jumping here, the first row that we have set up is going to be our trigger, and these first two sections that are going to be responsible for going out to our data lake and retrieving all of the relevant news stories for the day. Let's jump into the trigger and see what's actually going on here. Scrolling down, we can see that our two fields we're providing are going to be the date, and we're going to actually allow us to paste in the previous newsletter content. The reason for this is when I actually just click execute workflow here so we can see it, I'll just grab yesterday's date. And why we allow previous newsletter content in this field here is we want to avoid writing about the same story day after day. And so if we're covering a major update around, a new OpenAI model that was just rolled out, usually over the course of the news cycle, we're going to see that some people cover it the day of, some people cover it in the following days. And so by including yesterday's edition of the newsletter, we're actually able to tell and prompt our AI here to avoid duplicating that story. And so we don't have to lead to duplication that ends up in a resulting newsletter. So that's something that for our use case made a lot of sense to extend. You have a lot of flexibility here when extending this on your own to treat that differently, or even get more fancy with that to look back across multiple days. For us, it works pretty well by just pasting in that previous newsletter, and so that's why we set it up that way. Going ahead next, let's jump into section 1 here, which is going to be responsible for going to the data lake and retrieving all of the markdown content fetched off the internet. And so if I pull up this node here, we're looking at an S3 node, and so just the plain built-in S3 node. We're going to use the bucket resource, which means we're going to look to a data bucket to perform a search on the bucket for all of the news stories that were loaded up for the date. So let me actually look back at a past execution, and I'll come back here with some data that you guys can see actually flowing through. Back in here with a previous generation of our newsletter, and we can see some actual data inputted. So for the date, we can see that this was on June 5th, and we loaded up our previous newsletter content. So when we're calling into this S3 node to search for markdown content, we can pull up this expression and see that we're looking for the date inputted and this folder prefix. And so very similar to what we do in the UI for our data lake, if I actually pull up that search, we're going to get a list back of all of the scraped articles off the internet that we want to go forward with processing, which is exactly what we need. So jumping back in, we're going to get those results of the search. So we got 104 news articles actually loaded. We're going to filter that down to only files that end in Markdown with this MD file extension, because in our system, we're both scraping the raw HTML and the cleaned up Markdown format of that content just to keep good source of truth data. You don't have to do that, but for us, that's why. For us, we wanted that source of truth data saved, and so that's why we opted to go that way. Next up, this is pretty specific to our system, but we're going to be making an API call to our own endpoint, which actually plugs in that file ID to get back additional metadata we saved earlier. And so if you recall on our data ingestion pipeline, these last couple of steps here, we use this copy markdown file, set some extra metadata here, so we can look at things like who's the author, what's the source, what were the external URLs extracted from that article. And when we tie that back into our main agent, this is how we're retrieving that metadata for later processing. So again, if you're using a database, you could probably just query for this, but not every use case is going to need this. I just wanted to explain how we're doing it. Let's go forward to the next step. We're going to actually filter out other newsletter types when we're looking to build out our own newsletter content. So, if we're looking back to our pipeline again, you guys may recall that we have these triggers here set up that are actually going to be scraping from other newsletters. We're actually not going to be using that content when writing our own. This is something that we like to save each day just to sanity check if there's any gaps in our scraping system, so that if another newsletter covered a major story that we somehow missed, we're able to look back and see what happened. But for the sake of generating it on our own, we're going to exclude those. Jumping forward again, is another S3 node, but instead of searching, this time we're going to use the file resource and actually download the file from our data lake. And so after all that filtering is done, all that processing is done, we've gone from 104 initial items searched for. We're going to get down to 49 items here after the filter, and each of those 49 items are going to be downloaded as their own file. So the result of this step is going to be a large list of files actually saved in our execution here that we can use for later processing. On each of those 49 files, we then are going to use this extract text from file node, take in data, which is the input part of our file, and output it also as data, which is going to be the resulting markdown text content. This is super important because it can be expensive or not the most easy to work with LLM calls in file uploads. And so we're just going to read through all of those files that we downloaded from our S3 bucket, extract the text content from those files. And so we have a nice variable we can use in later expressions we're building and later prompts we're building up for the newsletter. And so in the next step, we're going to do exactly that. We're going to use this set field node. And if I pull up this expression here, we're going to be creating this content field that has cleanly formatted markdown data with all of the metadata we were also able to extract from that S3 get object metadata API call that we made. And so identifier, this is the identifier of a piece of content that we refer to in our system. We use XML blocks here to start and finish this piece of content, just to give the LLM a very good delimiter when we're passing this into the prompt. Because later on, when we're going to ask AI to pick out the top stories, all 49 of these stories that we downloaded from our data lake are going to end up there. And so we want to make sure that the content that we're passing in is in a very easy to read format that has good metadata with it, and has a good delimiter so the LLM knows exactly when that story starts and when it finishes. Finally, we take those 49 items, use this aggregate node to bundle those all up together and output it in a single data field. So after we get all 49 of these items bundled together, we are going to have a single list that we can again clean this up nicely on a set field node. And so we're going to be building this content result, which is a little bit like a helper variable we can use just to store all of the stories together in one single value. So this just makes it easy for us to load anytime we're prompting against this data, to load up every single news story in a very clean LLM ready format that's going to be easy for us to prompt against. So that's the gist of it for fetching our markdown content out of our data lake and going forward with the rest of this automation. Moving on to step 2 here, or section 2 inside the agent, we're going to be doing the exact same thing, but this time we're going to be loading up the Twitter content that was scraped from the internet and from our For You page. So very similar to before, we're going to be using the date as the prefix, but instead of only having a / here, we're adding the tweet dot characters. This is just a naming standard that we built in our system where we save tweets as JSON files inside our data lake, all with the name prefix, tweet dot, then followed by the tweet ID. And so in a real production use case, when we're loading this in, this is going to look like a series of numbers here. And those are all going to get loaded up together for us to bundle together, download, extract the metadata, and finally combine those all together with a similar content result set field node that is going to be easy for us to pass in to an LLM for further prompting. Now, moving on to the next row here for our AI agent, what we're going to do is actually use all of those scraped stories that were retrieved from the data lake from before, pass that in, and start prompting against it to begin writing the newsletter. And so in this green section here, we have all of the logic necessary to pick out the top stories. So going back to our format for the newsletter, we're looking for 3 to 4 of the top AI stories that happened during the day that are going to be the most interesting to our readers. And so we're going to go ahead and build that here in a new set field node and set our select our top stories. This is going to be the prompt that later gets passed into the LLM, and the LLM is going to be responsible for reading all the stories, grouping together related stories, pulling out all the links, and deciding in an ordered list what are the top 4 stories we want to go with. And so this is a pretty big prompt. This is all going to be available for you to download, but at a high level, we break down the task, give a lot of context around exactly what we need it to do. We pass in the context from the form input trigger on what are the stories that we want to exclude, basically what was included in the last newsletter, and give some extra context around how we want the output to be formatted. Add some constraints in, and even some more guidelines below this. And so you can see there's a lot that's going on into this, and then at the very bottom is the spot where we're going to actually pass in that large list of stories that were scraped for the day. And so just like from before, we can see all the tweets, all of the news articles that were extracted and scraped from the internet. We're going to build that prompt and then actually pass that prompt in to an LLM call. And so this, not a whole lot to it. We're just going to look at the stories prompt that we built from before and give it a system message here that just gives it a little bit more context about what the role of the AI is for this particular LLM call. So you are an AI assistant specialized in reading raw text about AI-related news, trends, and breakthroughs. Your objective is to determine which stories should be included in our newsletter, and then we break down some more context. Pretty simple call there. The important thing to note here as well is also going to be the structured output parser we have set up. Since we're asking a lot here, we opted to go forward with this auto-fixing output parser. And so if the JSON that the LLM call comes back to us is not exactly matching this full schema that we've built out, it's going to use I think we're using Claude in this case, to actually try and correct that to match the exact format that we need. So what this does is it just makes your automation a little bit more reliable here. And so you don't have to wait 10 minutes to get to this point, see an error, and then have to restart the whole thing over again. This just helps you avoid the automation from being super brittle. So that's the gist of it for picking out our top stories. If I pull this up again, we can see the structured schema that we've defined on what the top selected stories should look like. And so in short, we're having the AI build out an array, which is going to be a list of those 4 stories, as well as including a title of the story, the summary of what the story is going to cover, and the important part here that we're going to use for passing forward is this extra metadata underneath identifiers and external source links. This is important because we're going to need to reference the source material that we actually scraped off the internet and later prompting. And so we want to have this context passed all the way through the system when we get down into actually writing the newsletter. So that's what we're looking for there. And if I blow this up one more time, identifiers on the selected stories will simply be a list of the names of the files that we want to reference back. Going forward now, we're actually going to go down into this set field so we can merge output from these 2 LLM calls. I'll get to this one a little bit later. Go forward with some Slack notifications that are going to share what was selected as the top story. And on this final one that says send and wait message, what we're going to do is actually use the human in the loop process to pause this automation, share what the AI outputted, and then that gives us and our editorial team a chance to actually review what top stories were selected and decide if we want to go forward or if we want to loop back and have some edits applied to those top stories. When it comes to complex tasks like this is something I like to do on my automations that I'm building, is a brief pause to share what has been decided and then ask for feedback. So this can be accomplished by this send and wait for response operation on the n8n Slack node. In order to loop back, we do a simple extract. So we have a prompt here that is mentioning the couple of different scenarios that we can see coming up. So if I write this is approved for all of the top stories that get selected, this is going to classify this text as approved and continue forward with the rest of the automation. If this classifier decides that there is actually feedback text provided, such as, I don't like story number 1, let's replace it with something else, that's something we will do often. This is going to return a false value. And on this true-false statement, if the previous node was approved, if that's false, we're going to loop back here and get into our edit top stories prompt. And so this is going to be very similar, where we're providing, a task and telling the AI that we want you to act as an expert editor and writer for newsletter content. Your sole function is to implement specific edits based on the provided feedback without altering any part of the original content. So basically, what we're telling the AI to do here is we want you to go back to the drawing board and apply the feedback that we gave on this Slack send and wait message and try generating those top stories again. And so it's a little bit overlapped here, but if we look at the output parser for this one and this one, both of these LLM calls are going to funnel into the exact same top stories result that we defined here. So once the edit finishes, we're going to merge that in. So by looking at the JSON.output, set the current stories value, share that in Slack again, and start that process over for waiting for approval. And so this means this gives us a good interruption point in our automation where we can continuously give feedback where needed until we're happy with the top selected stories for the day. Once everything looks good, the stories are approved, and we're able to proceed, we then get into this purple section here, which looks very similar, and that's going to be responsible for actually writing our subject line. And before we get into this, we have it structured very similar as well, where we're going to define the prompt here and actually set up some good examples of subject lines that we want to feed into that prompt so the LLM has a good reference of something that we're looking for. When I pull up this prompt that we're going to use to pass into the LLM, it's structured very similar, where we define a role, the core objective, we're going to tell the AI what you're going to receive as input, and give more output requirements in other contexts for the stories that were selected. So I won't go through every single piece here, but all of these prompts will be available for download and linked to in the description of this video. So be sure to check that out if you want to see this and see how we've approached the prompt engineering side of things. Once those are sent, we are going to pass those values into our LLM call to write the subject line. So again, just that prompt gets passed in. We have our output set up to give us a structured response of the subject line, some other subject line ideas, as well as the reasoning tokens that were used for actually thinking through the best subject line to write. All of those values then get shared into Slack and are going to go through a very similar human-in-the-loop approval flow, just like we covered from before on picking the top stories. And so if the top subject line selected looks good, we're able to exit out for true and continue to the rest of the automation. If it's false, we're going to break out, loop again, and then go to this edit subject line prompt, where they will be responsible for being an expert copywriting editor who will be crafting subject lines and listening to the feedback that we've given. So now that we've completed the process of picking our top stories, the subject line, and have gotten those approved, it's time to pass all of this context into the blue section we see here, which will be responsible for looping over each of those top selected stories from here, and then actually building out that newsletter content that expands on the story. So going back to our newsletter, just as a reminder, this is going to be a section that we see here with our title and all of the content expanding on the stories we were able to scrape off the internet. So let's jump into this going node by node. When we get started, we're first going to go ahead and just do some data cleanup here where we're getting the value from, the top selected stories. So we got the subject line, the pre-header text, and the top selected stories all in a clean, easy to read format. The thing I want to call out here, if you remember from before, is going to be the identifiers and external source links that were passed through and still get set here. When we go to actually write out our newsletter, these identifiers are going to be extremely important to have accurately saved here, because we're going to go back out to our data lake, fetch those files again, load that context up, and so we can write a very focused newsletter section just looking at those scraped stories instead of the hundreds of news stories that were first evaluated in the pick top stories prompt. So that's a little bit of context of what's going on here. Let's continue through each of these nodes. So stories get selected, we split those out into each individual section, and then we begin this big looping block that I'll highlight right here. Everything that you see covered in here is the logic that will run responsible for creating a single segment in the newsletter. And so we're going to loop over each of the stories selected, run the same logic as for as many stories that were selected, and finally break out of this once we have the segment content actually completed. So if I jump in, let's go ahead and look through what is happening. Set field node here to start with. We're going to set the current story to actually evaluate, just some data shuffling to make it easier for us to work with. Moving on, we're going to split out those content identifiers we were talking about earlier. And so for each of those content IDs here on the identifiers array, we're going to split those out and start fetching information, metadata, and actually downloading that file from our data lake once again. So we're going to make this API call to get the metadata. We're going to go into our S3 node to actually download that file once again and output it as this file named data. And we're going to use this extract from text file node, just like we did in the beginning, to go from this file into markdown content that can be later prompted against. The reason we repeat this again is just in order to keep everything clean and tidy within the segment iteration loop that we're doing here. And so we're able to kind of do a reset, get everything bundled up nicely for future prompting as we get into the actual node down here that will be responsible for writing the newsletter segment. So this is just an approach we took to keep the data flowing nicely and avoid any extra stories getting pulled in that we don't want to write about. So we get that set up. We're going to prepare that content again in an easy to read format with XML here to delimit the stories, all of our metadata, and then in the middle, we'll have the actual story content itself. We're going to go ahead and aggregate this together so we have a nice list to iterate over. And on this true false node here, we're going to go ahead and look at the metadata of the stories to see if there is actually any external links we want to look at for future processing. If you remember from before when I was talking about on our data pipeline where we want to use this node here to check if there's any external links we want to extract, this is the part of the automation we're going to actually use those links to fetch more context for us to write about. And so if we determine that those extra links exist, we're going to go ahead and split each of those links out and start a scraping operation, much like what we did earlier, to on the fly capture that primary source of information we need more context around to actually build out the newsletter. So to go back to that NVIDIA example, if there is a Bloomberg article that's getting passed in through here, and on that Bloomberg article, there's a link to the NVIDIA website, we're going to go off to this true branch. We're going to actually try and scrape all of the content on that NVIDIA website link and bundle that back into the prompt we're going to write for the segment itself. And so we found this to be super valuable when building out our newsletter because it allows us to get below the surface details that, a Bloomberg, a TechCrunch article may be covering and quote some more specific stats that just makes a better reading experience for all followers of the recap. So that's what's happening there. If there are no external links extracted, we just hit this false branch and are able to continue into the main node for writing the newsletter segment content. So let's open this up. This again is going to be a mega prompt where we set up a lot of the task and purpose of what's going to be happening and break down details of what the writing style needs to look like on the output we're going for. And so we're giving context around the audience, what kind of writing we're inspired by, what other writing guidelines does the LLM need to consider. So this is things we need to emphasize, things to avoid, things that must absolutely be excluded. We break down what is going to be the structure of each section within the newsletter. If you guys are subscribers of the recap, up top, we always start each section with the recap section. We then break down an unpacked list and finally follow up with a bottom line. And so what we're doing in this prompt is really getting in to the nitty gritty specifics of exactly how we want this newsletter section to be formatted on our final output. And so as you can see, there's a lot here. When you're writing this for yourself, it's going to take a lot of iteration. And so I don't actually recommend you copy and paste everything we did here. I would encourage you to go out and explore and experiment and look for your own examples of how you can get the writing to be in the exact style that you need it to be. Additionally, if I just scroll through here, we have some other things like tone and voice we need to cover, formatting tips, and finally close out with hyperlinking requirements, which will allow us to actually include relevant contextual links that go out to real stories and announcements. So there's a lot to the prompting part of here. Again, this will all be included in the download for this n8n template. So you can explore this in more depth and see what changes you need to make a newsletter truly your own. After that finishes running, we have a follow-up prompt here, which is going to be responsible for looking at all of the source content and trying to extract image URLs that appeared in that source material. This is helpful for us because we want to include relevant images on each story too to make it more eye-catching. And what this does is it's going to output a large list of all of the URLs that were extracted from the source material. And so we can scan those one by one to see which ones may make sense to include or may make sense to exclude. Just makes the manual part of publishing this a little bit easier for us. And that pretty much covers it here for a single iteration of writing a newsletter segment. And so what we're going to do at the end, we're going to set that in a field called story segment. We're going to loop back to iterate stories and repeat that entire process for every single item that was input here after we split out the stories. And so depending on how many stories were selected from pick top stories, that's going to get fed into here, looped over, and only stop once each segment has been finished writing. When that is done, we're going to hit this done path here after the loop and bundle the final content up nicely so we can see what the final newsletter will look like in Markdown format. And so if I pull up the result of this node, we can see that we have Markdown formatted newsletter content with, bolded text, contextual links included, and that all follows each of the segment structures that we've outlined in our prompt. So that covers it here for the blue section responsible for writing the core segment stories of our newsletter. Let's zoom in here to the bottom row and go through the last parts of this automation responsible for putting the finishing touches on our edition of this newsletter. Starting here on the yellow section, we're going to jump into the prompt responsible for actually writing out the intro section of our newsletter. Again, looking back at our newsletter, every single edition we put out is going to follow a very similar structure to what you see here, where we start off with an intro, we have 2 paragraphs covering the top story of the day, and then break out extra bullets covering each of the additional stories for this newsletter. So pretty simple formula to follow, but it does require us to actually prompt well so we can pass in all of the context from before, like the top selected stories, and the contents that we just wrote for each of those stories, and write about it in the intro. So if I blow this up, we can see, once again, the prompt we've created follows a very similar structure to everything else we've been doing, where we give the role, we give the objective, we break down what input is going to be passed in, and then continue to expand on any constraints, guidelines, and other requirements that we need this writing to follow. In addition to this, we do like to provide examples that we would consider good writing. This is super important for us to go forward and actually give the LLM examples. So whatever it's creating, we know it will be good. Finally, going down to the very bottom here is going to be how we build and bundle up the necessary context that LLM needs to create this. And so we're going to be passing in the resulting output of setting the top selected stories, what is the pre-header text, the preview text that's going to appear on the email, as well as the combined content we created from before. That is the well-formatted, markdown formatted content for the newsletter edition. That all gets bundled together into this prompt, and the output of this will be our intro here. Now, moving on to the next LLM call here, we're going to be building out what we call the shortlist section of our newsletter. Just to preview this again, if we scroll down to the bottom, this is going to be the section that covers other stories that didn't quite make the cut to be a top selected story. These can be stories that were, not as interesting, but still AI adjacent, or there just wasn't enough conversation or context included on our scraping operation to really expand on it and unpack it like we do with the other stories. And so the way we build this is very similar to the other sections, and that's going to be covered by a nice detailed prompt that breaks down the role, breaks down the context, and at the very bottom here is going to pass in all of the main stories we've already covered, as well as the full content from the previous newsletter edition. We do this so in our prompt, we can explicitly call out the LLM to make sure that we're not duplicating stories between what was included on one of the core main sections, and we want to make sure that doesn't get duplicated in this bottom shortlist. Now that everything is ran for creating the newsletter content, the final step for us to complete is formatting the full newsletter together so we can simply copy and paste this output into Beehive and get that newsletter edition scheduled for tomorrow. All we have to do for this is jump into this set field node once again and stitch together the output from previous nodes to get that final markdown content we need. And so just going through the list here, we have our subject line from before, we have our pre-header text from before, we have the resulting intro that we created, each of the combined core newsletter segments, and finally close out with the shortlist that we just created. And so when we scroll through here, we can see that we have a nicely formatted markdown file that can be copy and pasted just into Beehive with all of the bolded text, all of the contextual links, and all of the header levels set just how we need it to easily get that imported and sent off. To make that a little bit easier, just for our own internal workflow here, we're actually going to take that text content, convert this to a markdown file using this convert to text file node, upload it to Slack, and share a message with that file attached so we can copy and paste it even easier.
All right, before you go, make sure to hit the like and subscribe button. Seriously, do it, because we're gonna be breaking down all of the AI automations that we use to run all of our businesses. They're super helpful, and we're gonna break down exactly how we do them on this YouTube channel. So make sure like and then subscribe, and then you'll get notified when we publish new workflows that can make your businesses run 20 times more efficiently, just like we're seeing here at the recap and the other businesses that we're running. The other item is join our school community for free. The link's in the description. You'll be able to get this template, this automation that we just ran through in this video, completely for free. You can go to school and navigate to the video that you want, and then you can download the JSON output for the n8n automation. With that, you can upload it into your n8n, clone it, and then tune it for your business and your use cases. So like and subscribe, join our free community to get this automation for yourself, and we'll see you in the next video.